And if you're watching, oh, we're still syncing, okay. Meeting is now streaming live on YouTube. So if you're hearing this, we're about 3 minutes away, well, probably closer to 5 minutes away from starting. I'm just getting it set up so that I can link to the YouTube video in the activity center, because again, I can never find the actual YouTube link until YouTube has started. Still haven't solved that. I don't know if it can be solved, but okay. But we'll have this up to date in the activity center in just a few seconds here. All right. Almost set. Page, publishing the page. There we go. So, all right. So let's come back. So I'm just going to start up the video here. Ooh, we're very blue today. Very, very blue. Let's see if I can't pull that back a bit. Wow. Yeah, I really need to figure out a way of, you see that? That's the mirror behind me, and it reflects the window up there. And and of course, all this light on my face is also coming from the window. And I really should figure out a way of just dampening down that light. Let's see what's going on in my office today. Doing some color printing of photographs. I have this print here that I got a while back. Forget exactly where. But I'm just flattening that out so that I can put it in the frame and hang it on the wall. I wish I could remember where I got it. It's a pretty cool print. It's kind of damaged. It's dented, dent in the middle, but it's hard to see the dent. It's just on paper or cardboard, Odon 06. And really it's actually sand on the surface. Well, it's not really a print exactly, I guess, but okay, any news? Let's check the email for some news. Don Tapscott still pushing his platform revolution, blockchain technology. Delete. What else have we got? Just a reply. InVision, make sure your voice is heard. Take the survey. Delete. Lorex is having a Black Friday sale. Big deal. Delete. This is from a press person. I am reaching out to you today for DH2, what? I. DH2, it's a lowercase I. I thought it might be a J. DH2I's Connor Cox and Microsoft's Amit Khandelwal's joint presentation titled How to Deploy Highly Available AGs Across Containers in Azure. Yeah. Maybe not. Let's see what else we got. Not much else. Still nobody's joined yet. Oh, here we go. Here's Mark. And we're getting going here. 12:01. And we'll just get that up and running. All right, so this is the ethics, analytics, and duty of care live session for November 1, 2021. Hi, Mark.
Good morning, Stephen, or good afternoon in your case.
Yeah, afternoon. I'm going to crank up the volume a wee bit here so I can hear you. Did you have a fun Halloween?
I did.
Good.
Had nothing to do with Halloween, but I went to a barbecue with some friends, and it was a good Sunday afternoon.
Very nice. We had one trick-or-treater. One.
We had two.
Three. Oh, two, yeah. Although I shouldn't complain, that's one more than we had last year. So maybe they'll come out again.
Yeah, we were in a kind of a hilly neighborhood and a house with a big uphill approach from the street to the house.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
So I asked, so one of the guests insisted that we had candy for the kids.
Yeah.
As we went shopping for the barbecue. And so I said, okay, so what do you think the over on this is? I'll say 2. And luckily I didn't bet any money because I lost. We had 2.
Yeah. We went, and I'm very proud of myself, we went full-sized candy bars this year instead of mini bars. So I think that's a step forward.
Well, unless you're trying to reduce your candy intake, because now you're 1 candy bar less than whatever you had yesterday. So
yeah, exactly. Now we've got 2 full boxes of full-size candy bars.
Yeah.
Fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, I like both types. Kit Kat and Maltesers.
Maltesers must be a Canadian.
Yeah, it's their little round chocolate covered malt, like sort of, it's hard to describe. It's like sort of like a malt candy. It's has the same sort of consistency as sponge toffee, but doesn't taste at all like that. It tastes like malt, as in, like if you went for a malt shake.
Yeah, we call those malt balls generically. They're called
okay.
malt. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, there are different brands available. I like those too, but that's why I don't buy them.
And we've got Sharita joining us. I don't know how long I was staring at the Sharita is waiting to join you in the waiting room, but
yeah, I heard a little noise less than a minute ago. So
okay. Well, I hope she wasn't waiting too long. If so, I'm sorry, Sharita. I was only staring straight at the screen. Can't expect me to see something that shows up on the screen.
There we are.
There we are.
I got in a different way this time.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I went to the activity center and it wasn't going to let me in there. So I went to just the, the week that we're covering, and I got in through there.
Yeah, those links will always work because I've scheduled them all ahead of time. The activity center I sort of have to do at the last minute.
Yeah.
And if you're getting an older or cached version of that, I really should figure out how to automate the activity center. I think that would make a lot of sense, because it's silly that I have to update that every day. It's
right.
And it's just one thing, and it doesn't matter how many people are actually taking the MOOC. It's just one thing that I have to do. But still, it'd be better if it was 0 things.
Yeah.
Okay, so this week we have ethical codes. And I'm very sorry to report that I've done a detailed study of ethical codes and have summaries of more than 70 of them. And you'll need to read all of, no, I'm just kidding. No one would expect you to read all of them, but I'm sending out a link in today's newsletter, and I'll give it to you here in the chat room right now, to basically what I call the ethical code reader. Oops. Make list post. I'm just trying to find it here because I didn't have it right handy because that would be too easy. Okay. Copy link. All right. No, I've lost. I upgraded to Windows 11 over the weekend. Nothing's where it's supposed to be anymore. All right. Especially like the taskbar is wrong. Okay, so I've posted the link to the post in the chat. If you go there and click on the title Ethical Codes Reader, you'll be taken to it. It's a long Google Docs link, but you'll see it's broken into two parts. The first part is just the summaries of all the different codes, and I've organized them into the discipline. And then the second part is the code itself. In some cases, I've reproduced the entire code in the document. In other cases, when the codes ran to like 10 pages or whatever, I extracted the most relevant parts and put those into the documents. So that's our object of study this week. But like I say, we have the benefit of the analysis that I've already done on them, and I'll be sharing that through the week. And I have some slides today to give you that, just provide an overview to give you a handle on this, if that's all right with you. If it's not all right with you, tell me. Because, you know, just presenting slides is probably the most boring kind of activity you can have. But I think this is useful information and will be helpful. But before I do that, I want to see if you have any comments or reflections on what we've done to this point in the course. I know, I threw that question out there with zero warning that it was coming. So, yeah, if there's a rule for good quality online learning delivery, any rule that exists, I've broken it at least once, probably numerous times. But
well, I think just the existence of this course breaks every rule.
Yeah.
yeah.
But because they're bad rules, it's not.
Well, there is that, yeah.
Course itself.
Yeah, it's like some of these rules I've never really been able to comprehend, like and I'm all in favor of personal learning, learner-centered learning, learner autonomy, etc. But nobody has ever taken a course from me for that reason. Typically, they're looking to get some body of information which I hopefully possess or can at least point them to. And there's that contradiction, right? I mean, I've done all this work in ethics and learning analytics, and I'm trying to share that. I can't share that if I just sort of sit back and, okay, tell me what you think about it. It just doesn't work. So there has to be the presentation part of this. And I've learned to accept that over time because, I've done courses, I've done presentations and workshops where I've tried the other way, and basically people rebel and say, we're not in this room just to talk to each other. We can do that anytime. And I think that's a point. I mean, I want your reactions and comments to this stuff because otherwise there's no point in me doing it. And certainly I think it aids in our learning, but there has to be stuff to react to and comment against. At least that's my feeling.
Okay, so now you've triggered a reaction.
There's definitely value to the reaction because, as I mentioned previously, I mean, the shape of this course, this course is changing shape as we go through it based on those reactions. So it's certainly helpful to me and informative to me. Absolutely.
So I'm going to claim to be the first person that took the course just to explore his own agency.
Okay.
And do I have to then, be a smart ass and say, I don't care what you know? I don't think that's necessary.
Maybe that comes with the territory. I don't know. But
I don't know. I feel like I kind of know you, so I can kind of throw that in. But then it's being recorded, so I shouldn't have. But whatever. Yeah. So I'm in a traditional online course from a very liberal state college in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And perfectly qualified, nice professor teaching online, and not her first time because of last year. Yeah. And yet we post once, reply to 2 comments every week. So it is what it is. And it's an intercultural communication. So this week will be very helpful because I've been struggling with defining my own ethics and working class culture inside of a very bourgeois situation. In fact, last week I did a literature search for working class culture.
Oh yeah, good.
Nothing out there.
Nothing out there.
Almost. You see, I'm overstating.
Yeah, I know.
Very little peer-reviewed, academically published work on the culture of the American working class.
I believe that. Yeah, I'm not surprised.
A lot of the British, but almost zero on my culture, which I'm tasked with describing. And so your ethical search, even being centered in Canada, is going to be very helpful. Yeah. Anyway, back to the education and student agency. So in that institution, this is my last formal class I have to take. Because, and I've explained this to you, Stephen, but I'll explain to Sharita, I'm the first person this state university in Minnesota has approved of completing a bachelor's degree, in my case, using prior learning demonstrated on my own website, on my own domain, for their assessment for credit.
Very good.
So I'm the rat in the lab.
That's excellent because, people talk about it all the time, but they don't put it into practice.
Yep.
And that you were able to do it is just wonderful.
Yeah. Well, to get approved, now there's the doing it.
Okay.
Yeah. Now I'm taking, because of course you have to conform to all of their I'm missing the term. You have to have the different categories of classes.
Yeah.
So I lack their globalism category. So I'm taking intercultural communication. And then you have to have a certain amount of classes from them for the degree. And those are the ones I'm fulfilling with the prior learning assessment. Except for, and it is sort of it's an interdisciplinary program, so there's an intro course and an exit capstone course. But those are the only online courses I have to take, is those three. And then the rest is the prior learning. So now the task is to sit down and write up all this experience that I have, which I'm finding daunting. But
you'll find, I think that's probably as hard as doing the course.
Well, according to my advisor, that's the hardest part. Then because once you submit it for approval, you've done most of the work. So then it's just them getting a subject matter expert, me posting it on my website. So there's another bit of work. But then it's in balls in their court. So it's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah.
And I've studied, because I came to higher education as an adult a decade ago, and had such a terrible experience. Beyond belief. Really, I tell the story to people like, are you sure that's what happened? But it was a terrible experience. So I've been studying higher education for adults from the point of view of, old people, people with experience and agency. And because if you push back against the institution, if you try to apply your agency to an institution as a student, they fight back. They fight dirty, and there's a lot of them, and they have the money. So, so there's a book that I'll never get around to writing just about that, just about being a student leader at pushing 60 back then, and the treatment of not just me, but the whole student council when we really started pushing them. But anyway, so I'm particularly interested in learning management systems and distance education. And so circling back, I'm in this course just to experience it and to help co-build it and to see where it goes, because this is the future. That Sharita, I don't know if you know Brian Alexander.
I do. I follow him on Twitter.
Good. And he has a weekly Zoom. Well, it's not Zoom. He uses a different platform, but he has a weekly.
Yes, I've seen that. I haven't joined it, but yeah.
Oh, you should.
Okay.
Forum for educators. Oh, he brings in, I mean, now he's at Georgetown. I mean, he's a big shot now.
Oh, okay.
But when he lived in a cabin in the woods, he was doing really good work.
That's what I'm saying. I'm thinking Georgetown, but I envision him, in the woods someplace.
Yeah.
Right?
No, he moved to Georgetown a couple of years ago.
Wow.
And and he uses a platform that's actually more conducive to this type of work. Shindig. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's more interactive than Zoom, although Zoom has moved in that direction. But Shindig's a much better platform. But anyway, so now I've lost my train of thought. Brian. He's been tracking the closing of higher education institutions. Close to a decade now. And the dirty secret that he talks about is 1 a week in North America closes for the last several years. One higher institution a week. Merges, closes.
That's worth noting.
Yeah, and double check me on that. But that's my understanding is about 1 a week. The oldest women's college west of Mississippi here in California just closed. I mean, it's just shocking the colleges that are closing.
Well, it's like news media, and I remember very clearly people saying, newspapers aren't going to go away. They're too valuable to society. People won't let them close down. And yet the sector has been, more than decimated. It's been diminished to a shadow of its former self. And people get news, sadly, from places like Facebook and Twitter, or happily from my newsletter. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I do get news from your newsletter, and I get a lot of news from comedians on YouTube. They're actually doing a better job of independent media.
Yeah.
It's sad, but it's true. That's where it's going on. And now there's all these platforms emerging. Not just Medium is the big one right now, but Substack and now there's Rumble, some new video platform that people are moving off of YouTube to, because YouTube is, YouTube, Google is shutting down a lot of these platforms and censoring them. The word is censorship.
Right.
Yeah. So, which should be a big deal in America, but isn't for some reason right now. Anyway,
far be it for me to comment on American politics. I do have my opinions, but I'm sure Americans aren't interested in
this. This is neither the time nor the place.
Yeah, exactly. So why don't I do the thing on ethical codes while we still have time left in our hour? Okay, let me just set this up here. It always takes a few seconds because it'll take a little longer today because new windows. Slide.
So I'm going to ask Sharita while you're clicking around. Can you jump in either on last week or on
the whole
connectivist learning?
Can I jump in? Well, let me say something then. Having joined this course and having had the discussions with you and Stephen over the past, what has it been, 3 weeks? This is the beginning of the 4th. Yeah. Really got me thinking about, one, the way I have taught in the past. And 2, I retired about a year and a half ago, just when COVID hit. Which was dumb. But anyway, and I really found that I was enjoying what I was reading and what I was doing. And it was, very much for me, some form of mental stimulation, especially if I'm really shut off. So as a result of this, I was approached by someone from my old faculty who said, is there any possibility, Sharita, that you would teach online this winter? And I said, yes. So what it's done for me is it's stimulated all of that. And I know from what we're talking about and, how the connectivist MOOC works, that I'll probably apply a lot of that in terms of, my teaching this winter.
Cool.
So I'm very surprised that I've done this, but I've done it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I hope we can get a report back on how much of what you've learned is allowed to be used inside of your learning management system.
After you're retired, they don't have a lot of influence on you. And they never really had a lot of influence on me to begin with. I've always done what I wanted to do within parameters, obviously, but always done it. So
good.
All right, so let's start this puppy. Oh, this needs to be over here.
You're making me feel like I should not upgrade.
No, it's fine. It's more me being disorganized than Windows.
And have you spent the entire day it takes to get your settings all back the way you want? Like you said, taskbar.
I spent a good part of Saturday messing around with that. I had plans, but Okay, I'm going to try an experiment here. See if it actually records. Okay. I probably shouldn't have experimented live. Are you guys still able to see it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
and it says live on YouTube up in the corner, and I'm watching on Zoom, so I'm guessing everything's working.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay, so here we go. This is ethical codes, and all right, there we go. I've recovered. I have notes off to the side as well, and it covered them all up, which bothered me. So, so I don't have as many images in these slides as I usually do, and I feel guilty about that, but not so guilty that I won't give these slides. Ethical codes. Now, I should probably have a slide saying what they are, but basically, different professions bring together statements, which they call ethical codes, that describe the conduct expected of them as professionals, or as members of an association, or as a type of person. It varies. We'll talk about that. So the first thing that I looked at is why they're doing this in the first place. Now, again, I don't have references here. This is a summary of the ethical codes that I looked at. And there's, you'll see those in the ethical codes reader, but this is me pulling that information out of those 70 statements. Now, there are many more than 70 out there in the world. There are hundreds and hundreds of them. And so I'm not sure how statistically representative these generalizations are, but I can say that these generalizations exist. That is to say, there is a non-zero number of ethical codes that have expressed these reasons for existing. That's me being really precise. I'm persnickety that way sometimes. So, 5 major reasons. First, there's a concern that without a statement of ethics, unethical conduct will abound. I personally think that's ridiculous because unethical people won't be stopped by an ethical code. Nonetheless, you see this expressed. There is this concern that people will just be unethical unless they're told not to be unethical. More to the point and more widely expressed, I think, is that they're less concerned about good behavior, properly so called, than they are about the bottom line. You see numerous codes of ethics say that, in order to, actually get clients, we have to be trusted. And in order to be trusted, we have to do such and such. And if we're not trusted, we're not going to have clients and the business will fail. That sort of reasoning. There are some services and institutions that actually require these ethics in order to function. You can't perform your accounting function as an accountant unless your client trusts you. It's just not possible to do the job. Similarly, with law and lawyers, there are many functions that a lawyer undertakes as your agent that lawyer cannot take unless you actually trust them to do that properly. In other cases, and I found this especially in education and education-related cases, disciplines see ethical codes as essential to being recognized as a profession. So the reasoning is this, one of the things that distinguishes between a profession and some other occupation is that a profession is self-regulating. So that's why, you have doctors associations, lawyer associations, the bar, accountants associations, etc. Even the plumbers, the International Plumbers Union or whatever they're called. So in order to be self-governing, you need some kind of governance structure. And at least a part of this governance structure is a code of ethics. And then finally, the last argument is practitioners actually need them. And that's, I can actually see that one. Sometimes practitioners are faced with dilemmas. They don't actually know what is the ethical course to take. You see that especially in research ethics. Is it ethical to perform research on your students? Well, it really depends on what you're doing. If you just ask them what they think about something, what's your favorite color, where there's zero consequences, that's probably fine. But if you ask them, what do you think of me teaching this class right before the exam, probably not fine. And you need some kind of guidance. Those are really obvious examples, but there are pretty gray areas sometimes, and ethical codes sometimes, not always, sometimes help with that distinction. So here's an interesting thing, I think. Ethical codes are largely about standards of conduct. And they're typically characterized as imposing a higher standard of conduct than you would expect from a non-professional. Now, I sort of wonder about that. I don't see why this standard can't be applied to everyone, but it's part of the idea of distinguishing the professions from other people. Some of these codes, by no means all of them, are normative. And what that means is they instruct you as to what you should do and carry penalties, sanctioned by your association, if you don't do it. I labor over that because the word normative is very often misinterpreted to mean normal, and it does not mean normal. It means an obligation that is imposed on you. So normative ethics, for example, is the ethics of duty and obligation. But the intent of these codes isn't to be normative. It isn't to enforce the ethics, although they will if they have to. The intent is usually just to remind professionals of their duties and to, distinguish the profession as a profession. So it's important to note that while ethical codes are sort of related to legal obligations, they're not the same as legal obligations. And that distinction is going to become important later on in the course when we use the phrase duty of care, because there are two distinct meanings of the word duty, or of the phrase duty of care. One is a legal principle. A professional or any contractor has a legal duty of care toward their client. But the other is the ethical principle, which is more explicit about what care means and the origins of care and what the practice of care is. And that distinction applies here as well in ethics and ethical codes. There is this distinction between legal requirements and ethical requirements, even if the ethical requirements carry a penalty. So overall, now, and this is not 100% the case, but it's a generally accepted characterization. Codes are divided by what can be called values and principles. And then in the diagram there, we have practices, which are the actual implementation of these. The values are general moral values: honesty, trustworthiness, etc. We'll talk about those more in this module, but not so much today. Principles are the ethical conditions or the behaviors that we expect. And as Cooper wrote, an ethical principle is a statement concerning the conduct or state of being that is required for the fulfillment of a value. It explicitly links a value with a general mode of action. So the value, say, is honesty. The principle is do not lie to your client. You see the distinction? The principle refers to some type of activity, or it can also refer to a condition or a characterization, but something that instantiates the value. And then the practices are the individual acts. So a practice might be, I don't lie to my clients. And the principle is don't lie to your clients. So it's moving at the bottom, very general to very particular. I think this iceberg is actually upside down in a sense. There are usually very few values expanded into more principles, expanded into a large number of practices. Unfortunately, such an iceberg would just tip over. So the physics have to be respected. So sometimes you'll see ethical codes explicitly set up this way. More than half the time you won't, but you can kind of extract the values, maybe from a preamble or something like that, or more generally from the actual principles that are described. So even coming into this, without even looking at the codes, there are some questions we need to ask. And it says why, but it should say who. Who writes the codes? This matters a lot, as it turns out. I read a number of codes of ethics that were clearly written by the employer, as opposed to the people in question. And they contain things like, you must never do anything that tarnishes the reputation of the employer. And employees have an ethical obligation to do what their manager instructs. I'm not exaggerating. I did see actual codes like that. Sometimes they're written by the association in question. Sometimes, very frequently, they're written by the association in question. They may hire consultants to help them, but the actual body creating and approving the code are the people to whom the code applies. Lawyers write law codes, doctors write medical codes, teachers write teaching codes. I can't recall an instance where the code is written, even in part, by the clients. So we don't see the clients writing the ethical codes for lawyers or doctors or whatever. And we certainly don't see the students writing ethical codes for teachers or professors. It just doesn't happen. Never seen it. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because I haven't sampled every single code out there, but I haven't seen it. And then the other question is, how do they differ? Not presupposes that they differ. And one of the conclusions to be drawn here in this module is these codes do differ, and I'll come back to that. But I think it's worth thinking about how they can differ, just as a guide to investigation. The motivation and the purpose that we've looked at already, the interests that are represented when we ask who writes the codes, for example, the burden or the responsibility for acting or carrying out the obligations described in the code. We're having an internal discussion even now about disclosure rules for research data that's collected. And the question comes up, well, whose responsibility is it? Is it the individual researchers? That seems a little unfair given how little they control the computer environment. Is it the computer services people? That's kind of unfair because they're not even involved in the research. So there's a complex question here. And then enforcement, whether it's internal, whether it's external, whether there are appeals possible, and so on. Important questions, I think. I threw an economics diagram in there just because that's what came up when I did a search on values and priorities on Google, which tells me something in and of itself. So I'm not going to run through the list of values and principles informing these ethical codes in this presentation. I have a long list, and I'm actually going to create a set of data elements so that we can graph those, because why not? That will be fun and informative, I think. Related to that are the bases, or I don't want to say fundamental principles because that's not quite right. But, if you have, say, honesty as a value, and the value is basic in ethics, right? In these ethical codes, the question does come up, though. Why should we be honest? Just what is the basis for an ethical principle of honesty? You could argue that honesty is a virtue in and of itself, and there are philosophers who have argued that. But there are many other ways that we can think of as reasons why we should be honest, whether it has to do with character, virtue, utilitarian purposes like avoiding bad consequences, etc. So all of these values and all of these principles are tied to different bases, and we'll look at that briefly in this module. We'll look at it in more detail in the next module, quite a bit more detail. So we have that coming to look forward to. Another interesting question has to do with the research subject or the client. And again, I mentioned earlier, the clients never write these things. Sometimes they sort of do, but it depends on the client. People like students or patients don't write these things, but there are numerous clients for research. For example, an employer or a funder who very often will set the ethical parameters. Sometimes the research subject actually consists of colleagues, unions, or professional associations. They're researching themselves. Sometimes the client is quote unquote stakeholders. What we mean by stakeholders varies a lot according to circumstances. And we could talk about that. We will talk about that more later on in the last few modules of the course when we talk about, whose interests are being represented, who's writing the codes, and why, what their motivations are. There's a whole class of clients, of codes that have as clients people like publishers or content providers, copyright holders in general. This reflects, I think, the last 20 years of campaigning on behalf of those copyright owners to instill respect for copyright as an ethical or moral principle and not just a legal principle. Some codes view society as a whole as a stakeholder, and therefore a recipient of ethical behavior. Others, law and country, there's no small number of ethical codes that talk about patriotic duty as being a core ethical value. And I saw one that mentioned the environment as the recipient of ethical behavior.
Stephen,
yeah.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Oh, absolutely.
In the previous slide, you say research subjects, and also you were talking about clients. Yeah. To me, a research subject and a client may not be the same.
That's true. Yeah. And I was a bit confused there. Sorry, I'm having trouble. I no longer have the capacity to back up my slides. It gives me next, but not previous. Sorry about that. That's really annoying.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. And I tried to think of ways to separate those out because you'd think they were easily separated out. but they're not.
Yeah.
And so I had to put them all in a big bowl together, because, like if we think of an action, there's, the person who commits the action, and then there's the object or person to whom the action is committed on, which is the object of that action. And so this is trying to characterize the object of that action. If it's just a simple cause effect sort of thing, then it's pretty easy to find the object.
Mhm.
It's whoever you affected. But if we're taking effect to include ethical consequences, then the scope of this object broadens considerably, and the boundaries within it really fuzzify.
Okay.
And I know that sounds sort of weird, but that's what I found.
Okay.
And it's like, for example, unethical medical research has an impact not just on the people you are conducting this research on, but on wider society. And that's a truism that we obtain from the Nuremberg trials, right? It's not just a you versus that person thing. So the client of this unethical medical research has to include on whose behalf you conducted the research, the person on which you conducted the research, and the wider society that either benefits from or is harmed from the research. They are all clients, as odd as that sounds. And they all therefore become the object of that research. That's, and I don't think I can draw, I mean, we can draw them apart intuitively. Yeah, the person who paid for the research or the person who benefits is clearly different from the person who you're doing the research on. But when you actually try to apply that distinction in any sort of principled way, it falls apart.
Okay.
So even like the unethical medical research, right, might benefit the person on whom it's being done. I mean, that's the basis for like a gazillion science fiction stories. Okay, so I can't go backwards.
You have to come out of full screen to go backwards.
And that'll probably stop the slide recording that I was experimenting with.
Yeah.
So I've forgotten what that previous slide was, but the commonality. And the slide quotes from the Canadian Psychological Association Code of Ethics that says everybody should be treated the same regardless of, and then there's a long list of factors, including gender, sexual orientation, race, language, religion, etc. And I made the observation, no other code contains that list. So prima facie, they're not all the same, because we have this one that has a list that is completely unique to itself. But even within these, you have a lot of codes that do advocate for discrimination on the basis of various factors, including race, including nationality, including language, and I could go on through the list. So just simply by looking at that one phrase, we will be able to observe differences in these ethical codes. When we look at them in more detail, as we will through the rest of the week, I think you will be convinced that simply from a study of ethical codes, which presumably is where we would find the most commonality, the greatest degree of consensus, we cannot find a great degree of consensus. In fact, we can't find consensus at all. You'd think we could. And people talk like we can, but an actual empirical study of these codes, I argue, shows that we cannot. And I think that's a really significant and important finding, because it means that the ethics, as opposed to legal obligations, which do apply to everyone and represents a different sort of consensus, but ethics, we don't have a common understanding of ethics, which makes it very difficult, even in particular professions, to identify a code which characterizes those ethics. Now, there are also other problems with ethical codes, which I'll talk about in more general detail as we go through this. But I think that's the main thing that I want to say coming out of this module. We can't achieve consensus. We won't achieve consensus simply by creating yet another ethical code. All we will do is add to the pile of codes that disagree with each other. And the proof of that's in the reader, which is why it exists. So there's the link. It's also cat scratching at my door for lunch, but it's also in the newsletter today. And have a look. You don't need to read all the codes in detail, but I have short descriptions of them. Those are a fairly easy read, and they'll give you a sense of what these codes are about. But if you really want to see the proof, of course, you'll need to read all the codes or my argument thereof. I've got a paper that I'll be linking to as well. I'm also going to link to you a study of ethical codes in data and analytics specifically, or learning analytics specifically, which is interesting because the premise of that paper is there is a consensus, but then when you look at the actual codes, the actual details of the different values, you find that consensus is like 23% consensus, and hardly a full consensus at all. But I'll talk about that in a different session in one of the videos that I did this week. So that's her, the slide deck. I call it her because I called her a puppy to begin. Comments, reactions? Okay, let me ask a more directed question. Before this presentation, had you thought much about ethical codes at all in the first place? Nods.
Nodding, yeah, nodding isn't really good.
Yes, yes. Yeah. But from a very limited, I think, point of view, given I'm looking at all the various ethical, so yeah, I mean, I've gotten a little bit deeper when I taught methods, when I taught, research methods, because I felt that, students really needed to learn that don't just do research. You actually have to think of the ethics, in terms of what you're doing. But looking at all this list, no.
Yeah, that's characteristic. That's what I found, that the people who are interested in a particular code are interested in that narrow sphere and not the wider sphere. And it creates this illusion, well, I'll say it like that, this illusion of consensus where it probably doesn't exist. Because everybody in the room agrees, but they never ask anyone outside the room.
Right. And especially since that they ethical codes, as you were saying, are usually, they're not discussed with the people where the ethical codes have some kind of impact.
Yeah.
Right? Patients, students.
Yeah, I've been thinking about ethical codes, but from a different point of view. As a student, I've been asked, especially in this program I'm in, to think about and try to elaborate my values and ethics. And I'm finding it particularly difficult because they're back to the working class culture lack of research problem. I cannot find documentation on the overlapping groups of codes that I was brought up under. And I'm finding that a real problem. So I'm interested in this, but of course you're more concerned with institutional codes, and I'm more interested in cultural codes. So we'll see how much overlap there is.
That'd be interesting.
Yeah. But for instance, I only knew one set of grandparents. I'll try to make this brief. And one of my grandfather was a Presbyterian deacon from Inverness, Scotland.
Yeah.
And he married the daughter of a Texas cowboy homesteader, Indian fighter, true settler, an actual settler, not what we talk about today, not people born in hospitals that live in apartments on unceded territory, but an actual settler that fought his way to a river and kept it. And so I'm trying to figure out how those codes intersect with my California public education in the 60s in Los Angeles when I was running around Hollywood in the summertime. There's, that's an interesting Venn diagram, but I cannot find anything written about any one of those subsets.
No.
Very little, again, very little.
I think that's an important point, and it's actually not one that I had considered, but I ought to consider. I mean, we're all familiar with things like, the code of the road or the code of behavior among athletes. And I've even got a thing in the hopper, something along the lines of breaking the rules in a sport, violates some sort of code. Above and beyond the penalty that you suffer within the event itself. You don't win that way. And like you, I have my own, if you will, working class code. I do the long hair as part of that. That's reflective to me of the culture that I came from, and it's a very distinct culture from, quite frankly, any of these professional associations that I've studied, including associations that I belong to. And my code says things like, advertising poorly or bad food like McDonald's to children is morally wrong. And I think that's a lot more morally wrong than many of the advertising standards that exist today. Things like that,
Putting candy next to the checkout at the supermarket,
putting
down
candy
at the eye level of the 6-year-old. That's morally reprehensible in my book. Or
if your ethical code says that a refugee child must die in the Aegean Sea, your moral code is wrong. That seems to me to seem pretty basic, and yet the prevailing ethics of our time allow that. And
brought up research and education.
Yeah.
And to me, right now, probably the largest violation in all of human history. Now, how's that for? There's a word for that. I can't think of it. Beyond overstating, is going on right now. In that the debate is whether to give children an experimental genetic therapy disguised as a vaccine across the world. We're talking 1 billion possible children. I don't know, close to 1 billion. And it is an experimental genetic therapy that they're now calling a vaccine.
Mhm.
And educators in the United States, and I assume in Canada, are discussing whether they will go into the classroom without every child being vaccinated. And so that institution, it's not a single institution, obviously, is at this point promoting this experimental genetic therapy being injected in children. To me, that I'm going to read the Nuremberg Ethics again. That, to me just seems beyond.
That's where ethics becomes contextual for me, right? That's where it becomes doing something for the greater good. Now, don't ask me, what that good might be, but that's where I would, come from.
Yeah.
So here's the issue is the practice is getting ahead of the ethics, in my opinion. If they distribute hundreds of millions of shots this year,
Mm-hmm.
and then sort it out later, that to me is unethical. In Europe, they have the, what is that principle that you don't do something until you assess the harm of it. They're not, I want to say, sounds like proprietary, cautionary. The cautionary principle would seem to apply here. And then I have to say, let's look at the research that says that children below the age of 12 have very, very little chance of being affected severely by being infected with COVID. And we don't know what the long-term effects of this experimental genetic research will produce. And so there is some research being published that lays out the effects on children, because now millions of children have gotten COVID, and very few have died, very, very few. Most of them had leukemia, severe breathing issues to begin with. And so then you have to balance that against what is the greater good and who's greater good.
Those
here we
are
are.
questions.
We're in an ethical dilemma as a civilization at this point, since they're pushing this worldwide.
So I'm not going to weigh in on this because I don't want to argue. But I think it does, again, underlie the point that, our ethics aren't decided. Even if, Mark, I think you and I, if we did an analysis at a certain level, we'd be inclined to say that we have very similar, if not the same, standards of ethics. And yet, in a particular case, we might reach very different conclusions, despite having more or less the same evidence. And I find that really interesting. I find that less problematic than you might expect, particularly for someone who really thinks ethics is important and that people should be ethical, especially myself. But to me, it's a fundamental empirical fact that people have different senses of ethics, and we have to work from there. And how do we do that? And how does each person's sense of ethics weigh in? And to my mind, a lot of these ethical codes, if not all of them, are attempts to shortcut that process, right? The actual determination of ethics in a society or even in a professional discipline are very messy. like ridiculously messy, and Sharita, as you said, very often context dependent. And even like Mark, your context and my context, they're very different. And the overall information surround and environment that you have is very different from mine. In our society, what you just expressed would be very much a minority position. Doesn't mean it's wrong, but it means it's very much a minority position.
Yeah. Same here.
Yeah. Okay. That doesn't mean you just simply say, okay, well, we'll cast that position aside and go with the majority. That's a very old style of thinking that doesn't work in a complex society. That's part of my argument for the overall course, in fact. That, we can't shortcut the process by drafting ethical principles, because they will be seen to be, and indeed are, arbitrary, in some cases unfair, and in most cases unjustified. Now, of course, that presumes the ethical values of non-arbitrariness, fairness, and justification. You can see how this can get circular in a hurry. That's always been the problem with ethics. So part of the challenge of this course, to me, is to get out of that circular reasoning. How do we get out of that? Because it is a trap we can easily fall into. I say it's arbitrary, and you say, well, yeah, but what you're recommending is arbitrary too. And it's a trap. So we need to get out of that. How do we get out of that? So,
and what occurred to me while watching the slides is nowhere in there is power.
It's coming.
I assume it is, because it has to be.
Yeah.
Because that's one way you resolve this.
Yeah.
Is the big foot.
Yeah.
And that's typically how it's done. That seems to be almost universal.
So I'm going to take note, though, of what you said about these unwritten codes of ethics. I think that's relevant and needs to be considered here. And I think it's really useful, especially when we get to the later sections of the course, talking about how we can get ourselves out of this circular reasoning, because a lot of these unwritten codes are in fact instances where groups of people did get out of this unwritten, or out of these circular traps, and I think that's worth considering. We got to call it here.
Yes.
Because it's that time, but we'll get back together on Friday, of course, still before the time change. Apparently, a lot of phones in Canada made the time change last night.
Oh, really?
So there's mass confusion across the country about what time it is. Yeah, Bell Network phones. It was on the news. So I'm laughing because I'm one of those who opposes changing the time, because things that are not consistent really bothers me. And if one thing should be consistent in the world, it should be time.
Yeah.
And yet it points up the arbitrariness of it all.
Yeah.
So.
I think we should just all use the standard, the Unix time standard, that's counting the number of seconds from midnight, January 1st to 1970, Greenwich Mean Time. We count the number of seconds from that point on, that's what time it is. And if you're asking me what time it is, it's like 16 billion or so.
Right. Makes it hard to set up lunch days.
Yeah, it does. But anyhow, I've got some catching up to do with some of the slides from last week. So I'll be sharing those in the newsletter, and I'll be sharing some resources in the newsletter. I'm planning 2 tasks. One is to look at the one of the articles, Felge et al., which I'll be distributing in the newsletter tomorrow. That's the one that looks at ethical codes in learning analytics specifically. really useful to look at. And then another graphing task where you pick one of the ethical codes and you graph across to some of the principles that it contains. Or I might map it back to some of the ethical issues that we addressed in the previous. That might be a better graphing. Anyhow, a graphing task. That way I get to play with code as well as content. All right, then. So,
okay.
And if you have anything, by all means, contact me through the week as well.
Okay.
Talk to you.
Bye.
Bye
Bye.
for now.